some reason I didn't hear the bell. I think I was talking about deer hunting, but the hunters I talked to were not very successful, so it wasn't much of a story, in case you're wondering. It's good to see all of you today. Nice, crisp fall morning. Winter is just 20 days away. Aren't you excited? Well, actually, it's less than that now, isn't it? 21st of December, is that winter? Do the math. 17, 18, 19, 20, about 17 days away. Close enough. All right. Is that you, William, that said that? Close enough? Did you know that our own Bill McFarland was recently recognized as the State Auditor of the Year? And there will be yes, absolutely. I was going to save that to the 10 o'clock hour, but when you spoke up, that reminded me, and so I'm not going to mention anything at the next hour, but it will be in next week's bulletin. I didn't find out until Friday morning, and by that time the bulletin had already been printed, so there will be a notice next Sunday morning in our bulletin. Bill is not a politician, for those of you who wonder. He's a public servant. And there is a difference. And I always want to point that out. John Farley passed away Friday at Marietta Memorial, and there will be a memorial service for John Tuesday afternoon at 1 at the Hadley Funeral Home in Reno. I'm not aware of anyone being hospitalized in local hospitals at this time. As far as I know, Becky McFarland's daughter remains at the University Hospital in Cleveland. And at last report, the doctors were still not really sure what was going on or how to deal with it. Elaine Wallace is home and beginning her recovery. Again, I think I mentioned to you Wednesday night that will be about 6 weeks if everything goes according to schedule. And Elsie Bowen's daughter, that would be Sarah's sister and Bev's sister, is having surgery on the 13th in Tennessee. I think it's the 13th or 14th in Tennessee, but if you'd like to send her a card, the address is on the board out in the foyer. And one final note before David has our prayer, Frank Vought's birthday is today. So you be sure and wish Frank a happy birthday. And I forgot to put the card in the mail Friday, Frank, so this is my card from you, buddy. Happy birthday. You don't look a day over 100. I know he's not that old now. I said something like that about Dave Bowen one time, and everybody thought I was serious. And Dave really isn't 80. But I digress. David, would you have our prayer at this time, please? Thank you, David. That thing is just not in the right spot for my vision. My glasses make it blurry. Without my glasses, I can see most of it, so I'm going to do it without my glasses. This is a map of Palestine in 1967. The green areas are those areas that were occupied by the Palestinians, and the areas in white or a light gray are the territories that were occupied by the Israelis. And I want you to kind of fix that map in your mind. We're going to, at some point later this morning, look at another map that I showed you at the outset of our study, kind of a reason behind this particular quarters study. And what you will see is, I think, an explanation for why there is such animosity in this region, toward Israel. The Palestinians have been pushed more and more to the side, and the Israelis have occupied more and more territory. Now, I must confess to you that much of this new territory that has come online since 1967 has been territory that they have occupied following wars that have been initiated by Arabs or Palestinians. And as I think any Israeli soldier would tell you, to the victor go the spoils. And they have not hesitated when being victorious to occupy the lands that they've conquered. Now, when you look at this map, the northern section, and you can barely see up in the right-hand corner the Sea of Tiberias or the Sea of Galilee, that's called the region of Galilee. And for Bible students, we all know that this is where the majority of Jesus' ministry played out. In fact, he was raised, and you can see Nazareth, I think, on the map. He was raised in Nazareth to fulfill a prophecy that he would be called a Nazarene, though the prophets had predicted his birth in Bethlehem, Micah chapter 5, verse 2. That prophecy was realized, but they could not bring up their son in Bethlehem. You recall that Herod the Great set out to destroy all the male children 2 and younger in Bethlehem, and Joseph and Mary had fled to Egypt because they knew that their son's life was in danger. Pardon me. That his life was in danger, and they remained in Egypt until they learned of the death of Herod. They started the trek back from Egypt into Israel and would have gone to Bethlehem and raised their son there, but in the process of making the journey, they learned that Herod's son Archelaus was reigning in his place. And so they resolved to go north into Galilee and settled in Nazareth. And so most of the ministry of Jesus plays out in that region with visits to Judea and Jerusalem, primarily for feast days, the Passover in particular, but not exclusively. If you try to determine how long the ministry of Christ lasted, the way you do that is to look at the Gospels and count the number of Passovers that are mentioned. And the best gospel to follow in that regard would be the Gospel of John. When doing that, you reach the conclusion that the ministry of Jesus lasted somewhat in excess of 3 years. But that's the only way we have of making that determination. The central section was called Samaria, and we are all familiar with the attitude that Israel had toward the Samaritans. And remember, that people who lived in that central section were the result of the Assyrians defeating the northern kingdom of Israel and taking the Israelites into captivity and bringing foreigners in and resettling them in that section called Samaria. And the animosity between the Jews in the first century and the Samaritans was so great that many Jews actually refused to travel through that central section. If they were going north, they would go east, across the Jordan, head north, and once they had gone around Samaria, they would cross back into Galilee, somewhere north of the Sea of Galilee. Jesus, however, in the course of his ministry, did not react as typical Jews. He traveled through Samaria frequently. In fact, the story in John chapter 4 of the Samaritan woman at Jacob's well is an excellent illustration of this. He, in fact, in Luke 10, took a Samaritan and elevated him above both the priest and the Levite. So in his ministry and in terms of geography, he didn't treat Samaria any differently. The section to the south, as you know, where both Jerusalem and Bethlehem are, was called Judah. That was the southern kingdom, and it was defeated by the Babylonians. Think Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, and Daniel. And there was a 70-year captivity, and then Cyrus, king of the Medes and Persians, decreed that anyone who had been taken captive and who desired to do so could return to the promised land and rebuild the city, rebuild the temple, and reinstitute worship. And of course, Ezra and Zerubbabel, with the assistance of Joshua, the governor, were among the first to do that. This is the land which was originally promised, as you know, to Abraham and his descendants. But Abraham never knew what that land was. We're in the process on Wednesday nights of looking at the book of Genesis, and we've just about completed the flood, and we'll begin in chapter 12 in about 3 weeks or so, looking at the life of Abraham, his call, the promise to Abraham that he would be the father of a great nation and would be given a land, but not told where that land was, only that his descendants would spend 400 years in bondage and then would take the land. And from what we've already learned, we know that the land of bondage was Egypt and the promised land was Canaan, Palestine. Moses led the Israelites toward the promised land. He left Egypt with anywhere from 1.5 to approximately 3 million people. We can't know with absolute certainty. What we do know is that when they left and did the census of fighting men between the ages of 20 and 60 or thereabouts, the number was 603,550. And assumed that a majority of them were married, and most of the married men had children. That's how you get to a figure of at least about 3 million. Now, the journey from Egypt into Palestine was a distance of about 200 miles. How long would it take to make that journey? Quite frankly, weeks. It would not be that difficult to go from Egypt to Canaan, go back over 400 years, and remember that Jacob sent his sons into Egypt to purchase grain a couple of times. It was on the second trip that Joseph finally identified himself and invited, at the insistence of Pharaoh, all of the family to come down and live in Goshen. Well, more than 400 years has elapsed, and God has raised up Moses, and he will lead them to the promised land. But they won't do it in weeks. They will do it in 40 years, because he sent spies out, and they came back with a report. This land is everything we have been told, and they brought proof. But we can't take it. There are giants in the land. That was the majority report. The minority report, which was offered by Caleb and Joshua, said, you know, we can do it with God's help. Let's get with it. Well, the majority won out. And so God said, for each day the spies searched out the land, you will spend a year in the wilderness. And they had been out on this mission of discovery for 40 days. And so it took 40 years. And during that 40 years, all of those doubters and disbelievers perished. All 603,548. The only two who didn't, as you know, were Joshua and Caleb. Even Moses did not enter the promised land. He was able to lead them right up to the edge. He went to the top of Mount Pisgah, also called Mount Nebo, and he was able to look out from the mountaintop and see the Jordan Valley and see across the valley to the Judean plains, the land of promise. And then he died. God buried him. No one to this day knows where he was buried. And Joshua then led them in the conquest. But it's a fascinating story. Most people don't spend a lot of time in reading Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. But those books give us a lot of information about that 40-year period in the wilderness. And some fascinating things occur that I find very appealing. For one thing, for 40 years, they did not have to replace their sandals. They didn't wear out. Wouldn't you like to buy a pair of shoes and wear them for 40 years without any problem? Now, women are not going to agree with this, but from a man's perspective, that would be great. And their garments, the same. I think you wear a suit for as long as you can get in it. I don't care if it's in style or out of style. If I can get in it, it's fine with me. I like that idea of being able to get something and it lasts. But that's just me. That happened in the wilderness. God provided food miraculously for them and water as well. He gave them specific laws regarding sanitation, way beyond the day when people understood microbes and germs and bacteria and all of that. Just a fascinating thing. The land, as we said, was conquered under the leadership of Joshua. The best description of this conquest is, of course, in the book of Joshua. And by the way, I don't know who wrote Joshua. I know that it is an inspired book. It is found in the Old Testament, but it derives its name not from authorship, but from the fact that Joshua is the central character. And many times that's the case with Old Testament books. We may not know who wrote them, but they derive their name from the fact that a central character is highlighted. This nation, which had been promised to Abraham, reached its greatest heights, enlarged its borders to the fullest extent under David and David's son and successor Solomon. In the days of Solomon, Israel was the dominant power. And you may recall the visit of the Queen of Sheba. This is the region south of Egypt, who made the long trek in order to see if what she had been told, because the stories had spread around the world, as it was known then, that Solomon was, someone to be respected. He is wise, he is wealthy, he is powerful. And Israel lost that at the death of Solomon, when the kingdom divided and problems began to develop, and there wasn't this strong central figure to take charge and kind of keep everybody in check and keep the nation going. And they have ever since longed for a return to the days of David and Solomon. The northern kingdom was ruled by Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, and I highlight that because thereafter, when you deal with the history of the northern kingdom of Israel, the recurring phrase is, and they sinned after the similitude or after the example of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, who is notorious in regard to his idolatry. Jeroboam got the idea that if he didn't do something, because everybody came to Jerusalem, the southern kingdom, at least once a year if they could for Passover, that in time the people would forget about him and the kingdom would reunite. So he determined that he would build holy places in Dan, in the northern part of the kingdom, and in Bethel, right on the very border with the southern kingdom of Judah. Bethel was actually visible from Mount Zion, where the temple stood, if you looked in the right direction. So he put those altars there and made golden calves and declared a feast in the 8th month, of which the law required no feast, and he made of the basis of the people priests. And it's in that context that the story of the young prophet in 2 Kings 13 unfolds, where he goes and cries out against the altar, and as a result, the king puts out his hand and tries to stop the prophet, and then when he wants to pull his hand in, he can't. So he sings a different tune, and asks the prophet to intercede to God for him, and God restores his hand. He then invites him home to dinner, and the prophets can't do it. God said, go here, do your job, don't eat, don't drink, and when you leave, take a different route home. And he followed the directive of God, rejected the king's invitation, but then an old prophet lied to him, and believing a lie, he faced disastrous consequences, lost his life. But that's the division of the kingdom and why Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, is referred to so frequently. This northern kingdom under Jeroboam and his successors lasted to 722 BC. Quiz time. Who defeated the northern kingdom? This is what my ladies' class does on Thursday mornings to me. But they know the answer, they just won't say it. Assyria. Remember Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, the Persians, the Greeks under Alexander, intertestamental period, the rise of Rome to bring us to the New Testament, and the Roman Empire. That's history, biblical history, from the beginning of the kingdom to the arrival of Christ. The southern kingdom was taken captive by the Babylonians. And there were actually 3 incursions into Jerusalem and Judea by the Babylonians under the direction of Nebuchadnezzar. And if you want to read more about Nebuchadnezzar, read the book of Daniel, in particular the first 5 chapters, or read Isaiah 35, and you'll get some idea as to why the Babylonians actually invaded Judah and Jerusalem. Hezekiah had been sick, the king of Judah, and he was told to set his house in order. He was going to die. So he goes to God in prayer and asks for an extension. And God grants him 15 more years. And the Babylonians sent representatives learning of the king's recovery. And what does he do? He shows them the vast wealth of the temple and of the kingdom, and that's just like saying sick 'em to a dog. They wanted it, they would invade and take it, and ultimately that's what happened. When Hezekiah prayed to God for extended life, and God answered his prayer, he was childless. But in the interim, from the time that God extended his life until he died 15 years later, he fathered a son, Manasseh. And Manasseh was the longest reigning king in the southern kingdom of Judah. He reigned 55 years, and he was among the very worst. He even offered his own son in human sacrifice. That's how low. Hezekiah was one of the best. His son was one of the very worst. And I've often thought, how would the story have changed had Hezekiah not been granted those 15 years? Of course, I don't know the answer to that, but it's a question that I've asked myself. And I've also often wondered why in the Epistle of James in chapter 5, where we're told that the effectual fervent prayer of a righteous man avails much, and if a man is sick, we should pray for him. And yet the example that's cited is Elijah, who prayed that it wouldn't rain, and it didn't rain for 3.5 years, and then he prayed that it would rain, and God sent the rain. And I'm thinking to myself as I read that, why we have Elijah as an example and not Hezekiah, who actually was sick, prayed to get better, God heard his prayer and made him better through the prophet Isaiah. He gave him 15 more years. I don't have an answer for that either, but I can't help but wonder. That's the example I would cite if I wanted to illustrate how God hears the prayers of those who are ill and answers them. But at any rate, that's the land of promise that is constituted by the territory on the map I showed you a moment ago. This map shows the extent of the kingdom during the time of Solomon. And I know it's probably a little hard to see, but there's the dark lines in black that show the kingdom reaching all the way up to the Tigris River and all the way south down into the Sinai Peninsula. Now, again, this is not a huge territory, but considering the extent of the kingdom in its early days, this was a major accomplishment for Solomon to have essentially ruled over this extensive a kingdom. It went north into Samaria and actually into territory that would have been at one time Assyrian, and all the way south into territory that would have been one time Egypt. So it was rather an expansive growth for the kingdom under his reign, and it was a period of peace. Peace made possible primarily by his father David. David's reign was filled with a lot of conflict and battles. It was not until the days of David that the Philistines were finally dealt with. The Philistines had, in fact, been responsible for the death of Saul, the first king of Israel, and his sons, with the exception of Mephibosheth. And they had been a thorn in Israel's side throughout all of her history, up until the time that David finally conquered and defeated them. And Solomon's 40-year reign was essentially a reign of peace, which made it possible for him to expand his borders and to increase his wealth and influence in the world. And of course, being the wisest man of his day didn't hurt, for people came from all over to discover his wisdom. Some of the other lines that you see, the red line running through the Mediterranean all the way to Tarshish, they just represent trading routes that Solomon would have access to, because he built a navy that was kept at Ezion-Geber and mined gold and did other things like that. So it was a very prosperous time. This is a map of Israel during the divided kingdom, and you can see, I hope, the section in pink stripes. That would be the southern kingdom of Judah. And then north of that, the lines are blue or black, I believe. You see them running diagonally. They begin at the northern tip of the Dead Sea and run at a somewhat northwesterly line as the southern border, and then they reach above the Sea of Galilee and across into what was called in the New Testament the Decapolis, the area of 10 cities. That's the northern kingdom over which Jeroboam and his successors reigned. The northern kingdom had 20 kings in its history of 930 to 722, and the southern kingdom from 930 to 586 had 20 kings, which I find rather striking. But the lives of many of the kings of the southern kingdom and their reigns were longer than those in the north. The north was plagued, it seems, over and over again by violent uprisings, as one man would determine that he should be king over another and would work to eliminate the king that he might take his place. Happened far more in the northern than the southern kingdom. Now, this is the map that I showed you at the outset. Green represents territory that was occupied by Palestinians. White represents territory that was possessed by Israelis. In 1946, before the establishment of the Kingdom of Israel, as a result of the Zionist movement in Britain, Palestinians occupied nearly the entire area. Those little white specks were Jewish settlements, and you can see that the Jews were clearly in the minority in terms of land possession. Then in 1947, you go from 46 to 47, look at the dramatic change in the second map. You've got Palestinians in the green, the one section down there along the Mediterranean is what is still called the Gaza Strip, and the large section of green is the West Bank, and the West Bank, of course, is the West Bank of the Jordan River. And if you look at map number 3 here, what happens between 1949 and 1967, again, you see how Israel's territory grows and the Palestinians decreases up until the most recent map I could find was 2000. And look at what you have now. Israel occupies nearly everything. There is the Golan Strip, which is much smaller now, but still Palestinian. That's down there. And then the West Bank's up here. And it just gets smaller and smaller and smaller. Now, you imagine for a moment that we're dealing with Ohio and West Virginia. Right now, the borders of West Virginia run to the banks of the Ohio on this side. West Virginia owns the Ohio River. Well, I'm okay with that because I can have a West Virginia or Ohio license and fish there. It doesn't matter. But imagine over time that they kept increasing the border, and now the borders of West Virginia run all the way to the Columbus suburbs. What would Buckeyes think about that? They wouldn't be up in arms just in football. They would be up in arms for a lot of reasons. You can't do that. You can't take our land. Now, that's obviously not going to happen. I'm just trying to give you some idea of how Palestinians must feel, given that this is their history from 1946, when they were dominant, until the present hour, when they have just been squeezed and squeezed and squeezed. And now there are fences and walls and all kinds of restrictions. They don't have freedom of movement. Do you think you would be happy in an environment like that? Now, understand, I'm not saying that they haven't brought a lot of this on themselves, because they have. They have never accepted the Israelis' rights to be there, though the land was promised to Abraham and for century upon century occupied by Jews. They don't feel that the Jews have any right at all to be there now. And so there's this great animosity between Jews and Palestinians that's not going to get any better as long as both sides are raising their children to hate each other. And that's a microcosm of what's going on in the world right now between Islam and the West. We're not going to see any sense of peace and any solution to radical Islam and terrorism as long as Islam raises its children to hate the West. And if you want to know what the ultra-conservative Islamists believe, they believe that they are doing God's bidding by all of this chaos and conflict and death and destruction, because they want to lead to their version of Armageddon, in which the West will be defeated and a world caliphate will be established and Islam will rule the day. They have no use for Christianity, Judaism, Hinduism, Buddhism, or any other ism. There is just Islam. And they believe the way to succeed is by military conflict. You can't tell me that Christianity and Islam are on a par. That just simply is not the case. And why do they believe this? Because this is what the Quran, when taken literally, advocates. And Muhammad succeeded not because his message won the day, but because his men wielding swords won the day. And their response to all they conquered: convert or die. And guess what people do? Especially people who don't have strong convictions anyway, they convert, at least in name, that they might live. And that's the process that is unfolding again in the 21st century. It started in the 20th, fueled financially by the oil resources in that region of the world, which have kept our houses warm and our automobiles running, but they take the money that we pay for oil and they funnel it into Islam and to radical extremism. And the biggest supporter financially of this, as we noted at the outset, Saudi Arabia, our closest ally in the Middle East beyond Israel, or at least at one point. And they take petrodollars, having made a deal with Ayman in the 19th century by the name of Wahhab. They funnel this petro money to places all over the world to build madrasas, which are schools of indoctrination, and to build mosques, which are the meeting places and the centers of Islam in various communities. Every major city in America today, I think, has one or more mosques, very ornate, very expensive, not because the people who are aligned with Islam in America are so generous. They're being financed by Saudi Arabia and some others. And they really do believe, these ultra-conservative, radical Islamists really do believe that they need to bring the world to total war so that Allah's will might be done and Islam might therefore conquer the world. But Palestinians are primarily Islamic. And of course, the Jews and Islam have been at loggerheads ever since Muhammad thought that he could win the Jews to him, and they rejected him outright. And he altered some of his doctrine, and Jews became enemies of Islam rather than adherents. So that's the picture of that region. And again, how large is it? About 1/3 the size of Ohio. So we're not talking about a tremendously large piece of territory, but think of all the conflicts that have occurred in this region and look at its position. This is the route between the north and south, between Europe and Asia and Africa. They come down this stretch of ground between the Mediterranean, the Sea of Galilee, the Jordan River, and the Dead Sea. It's the shortest and best route for trade. And so it has been a center of trade for almost all of recorded history, and a vital piece of geography, though it's not very big at all. This is another map of Israel. I don't know if you can see it any better or not. I just thought I'd throw it out for you, more modern depiction. And here are 4 others that just highlight, and I realize they're small. The one in the upper right-hand corner shows Israel and Iran, and the distance is not all that great. And as you know, the Iranians fully intend to eliminate Israel from the picture. And interestingly, the Saudi Arabians, you may remember this, you may not, they say that the Iranians aren't even true Muslims. They're not true adherents of Islam because they are Shia and Saudi Arabia is Sunni. The vast majority of Islam are Sunni, the minority Shia in Iran, some in Pakistan, and then there are a few in Africa and Indonesia, but they're in the minority. But they seem to be more radical even in some ways toward Israel. Saudi Arabia, because of its animosity toward Iran, has actually backdoor channels partnered with Israel in some ways to deal with the Iranian threat. So it gets really complicated when you try to get all these sides together and understand what's going on. And we think of Islamic terror and what has happened here in our own country and in Paris and elsewhere. But by far the vast majority of people who have suffered and died under radical Islam have been Muslims. But that doesn't seem to matter to those who are leading this cause. Anyone who gets in their way is fair game. So this is the land where the ministry of Jesus unfolded. That's why we're dealing with it today. This is where the New Testament church began, in the city of Jerusalem sometime around 30 A.D. And I say that, and I know somebody will, I thought it was 33 because it started about 50 days after the resurrection of Jesus, and Jesus was 33 when he died, and you go from his birth to his death, 33 years. Well, the fact is the chronology, when first done by a man by the name of Ussher, was incorrect. He had the birth of Jesus occurring after the death of Herod for some reason. If you look at his chronology, Jesus was probably born in what Ussher would say was 4 BC. And that would bring us to about 30 for his death, about 33, between 33 and 34 years. His ministry began shortly after his baptism, and he was baptized at about the age of 30 by John, and that could mean anywhere from 29 and a half to 30 and a half, and we don't know. But sometime around 30 A.D., the church was established in Jerusalem, stayed in Jerusalem for a while, then moved to Judea, and from Judea into Samaria, and then from Samaria to the world. And you get that history in the book of Acts, especially starting in chapter 8. This is the place, therefore, where the early saints spread with the message of the gospel. In Jerusalem, on Ascension Day, Acts chapter 1, there were only about 120 disciples. But by the time Acts closes, within a generation, the gospel had gone throughout their world. And there were Christians scattered everywhere, and the church was growing. This is the land, by the way, that Israel claims, and many Protestants believe they have a perpetual title to. They were given this land as an everlasting possession with the condition that they be faithful. Were they true to that condition? And you know the history as well as I do. They were not. And so the promise of an everlasting title was made null and void by their unfaithfulness. It was a promise of God that contained conditions. The conditions were not honored, therefore the promise was made null and void. Jeremiah 18 makes a point of this. And so they do not have any God-given right to this piece of geography now, contrary to what they believe and contrary to what many Protestants believe. The true Israel of God today, if you read Galatians chapter 6, verse 15, is the church, spiritual Israel, and their claims to this land in perpetuity are false. So this is the land, over which Jews and Palestinians, therefore, have been fighting for centuries. Don't expect it to end anytime soon. And much of what goes on in the world today still has its roots in this conflict and what brought it about. Next week, God willing, we're going to look at Jordan